Okay, so I'm just going to do this quite relatively short screencast, just for those students that were unable to attend any of the the drop-in workshop that we did earlier this week. So we're looking at your task two, which is an academic essay, and essentially what I want you to explore in this essay, because it's only 1,250 words, so it's not a huge piece of work. That does not to say that there's not a lot of work that needs to go into it, however. But we're exploring the ethical impact of the brand on consumers. Okay, so I'm going to break that down a little bit more and go over some of the points that we made in the drop-in session that we wrote up on the board. Okay, so your brief is to write an academic essay, so clearly this needs to have a lot of supporting theory in it, and the total word count is 1,250 words, obviously plus or minus 10%. So provide a critical evaluation of the impact brands have on individual consumers from an ethical perspective. So by that, what we're really meaning is essentially the whole concept of a brand is trying to persuade consumers to buy something for its symbolic properties rather than functional properties. So it's about what a brand can say about you or how it can make you feel, or the kind of impressions it helps you make on others, rather than what the product is functionally going to do for you. Okay, and is that ethical or not? So because essentially what a lot of theory tells us is that by doing that we are creating wants, and we're facilitating consumer desires rather than what we actually need, which could be problematic if you don't have the physical resources, the money to be able to buy those brands. Where does that leave you as a consumer and as a human being? So essentially, that's what I want you to explore. I want you to think about ethical in terms of, are brands good or bad for us as consumers? So we're not concerned with the ethical strategy, the corporate social responsibility of individual brands. That's not what this essay is about. This essay is about, is the concept of a brand, this idea of developing something that's kind of got this intangible meaning attached to it, is that ethical or not? Is it good for consumers? Is it bad for consumers, and in what ways? Okay. So in the drop-in, we just went over the structure a little bit. Now, the thing is here, it doesn't matter how you structure your assignment. You structure it in whichever way you feel is appropriate. So this is kind of a broad guideline, but please, if it doesn't feel natural to you to do it this way, if it's not something, it's not the way you want to do it, then that is absolutely fine. You can develop your essay in any way that you want to, but this is just to help those students that might be struggling a little bit of thinking how to structure it. Okay, so it makes sense to start off with introducing the concept of a brand, but this needs to be relatively brief. Okay, but specifically you might want to explore this from a consumer perspective rather than the management perspective you'll have explored in task one. All right, so we're thinking about Grant McCracken, Susan Fournier, those kind of definitions of what a brand is. You need to have some discussion around the idea of symbolic consumption, which is the idea that I just talked about. So this kind of notion that we buy, we buy a pair of trainers not because they're comfortable. I'm not saying they're uncomfortable, but not because they're comfortable, not because the fit is nice, not because of the materials, but because of the symbol on the side of it and what that symbol says about us and how it makes us feel inside, and how we know others might evaluate us wearing that brand. Okay, so is that ethical? But you need to start off by exploring what symbolic consumption is. And then link that to some of the sort of core ideas around the self, extended self, stuff around self-esteem. And again, here you might want to just talk about a couple of theories around extended self and symbolic self-completion, that kind of stuff. You don't have to talk about every single direction of the self, because in 1250 words you just will not have the scope to do that. So try to be really decisive about how you want to develop your discussion, and therefore which are the most appropriate theories to include. Okay, now they asked you for some critical evaluation, and we talked about this in the drop-in, and the most sensible way to break this down and think of it really simply is arguments for and against. So make sure you add balance. So we're going to talk about ways that brands are good for us and ways that brands potentially are bad for us. And then clearly we need to bring our work to a conclusion, okay, with some concluding thoughts. So let's just go through some of the sort of arguments for and against. We start off with arguments for, and this is not this list isn't exclusive. So there may be other theories that you've come across. There could be other ideas that you have, and I would love to hear of them. So please do include them. Please don't think this is a finite list. You might not have the scope to cover all of this, so again, choose which ones you get on with and which ones you can make some really powerful points about. I'd rather you talked about a couple of these or one of these in a lot of depth and made some powerful points and explored lots of literature in this area than superficially, you know, a very surface level cover of all. How many have we got on here? 5. Okay, so just, you know, it's about depth of understanding rather than quantity of different concepts. So brands provide us with self-esteem, as we know from Isaacson and Roper's work. So they talk about this idea that by buying a brand, it can boost our self-esteem, obviously making us feel a little bit happier. The self-esteem very much feeds into our subjective well-being, which is our happiness. It's a self-belief, self-efficacy. So Garvey et al., which I've mentioned this article a few times about performance brands, where their research demonstrates that we perform much better when wearing a brand than without. We get a buzz out of buying stuff and buying branded stuff, and again, how that makes us feel. Brands can help us be socially accepted. They can help us fit in with people we want to fit in with. They help us, they facilitate smoother social interactions, which are really important in our lives. They can verify us. So we might think we've got a specific identity, and they help us express identity, but also verify it with groups of people. So think about all the kind of identity, self-expression, all those kind of benefits to owning different brands. Okay, so brands are good for us, but what if they're not? And lots of these are just counter arguments to the points that we've just made. So what happens if you don't have the resources to buy those brands? In the same way that brands make us, you know, they boost our self-esteem, they make us perform better, they give us social acceptance. If you think about it, without the brands, it potentially tells us that we can't do all of those things. So is it telling us that, you know, our brands, the idea of a brand telling us that actually without this brand, I won't be socially accepted, or I can't have high self-esteem, or I'm not going to perform well? It's kind of like every time a brand tells us they can do something good for us, they inadvertently tell us that without them, we're not going to do quite so well in life. So that to me is a little bit problematic. Isaacson and Roper talk at length about the commodification, so the buying and selling of teenagers' self-esteem, which is an important point to consider. Hamilton talks about this idea of brand stigma, where actually where some low-income consumers, there's lots of research that tells us that lower income consumers tend to be a little bit more materialistic, buy lots and lots of brands, and because they wear those brands so overtly, they become stigmatized. So it's kind of like we know what they're trying to do because we're savvy evaluators. And then, just as we were saying earlier, so think about how do we cope without the brands? If we need the brands to fit in, or you know, believe in ourselves, then does that mean that without the brands we're going to be sort of flawed somehow? Which ultimately could be problematic. So make sure you're supporting all your points here with theory. And again, don't need to cover all of these points. You need some really deep and rich arguments around the points to explore those points in a lot of depth. Okay. Inevitably, you're then going to draw some conclusions. What are your final thoughts? There's no right or wrong answer here. This is absolutely down to you and supporting, using theory to support the points you're making. You know, but it doesn't matter what the conclusion is that you come to. Just a further point, is that the context, if you want a specific context and you just want to talk about low income consumers, you just want to talk about teenagers or children or females, whatever it might be, that's absolutely fine. You know, if you just want to talk about Chinese consumers, or you know, if you want to culturally define it, or you want to define it by subculture, I absolutely do not mind. This is about, remember, this is about you demonstrating you understand the links between social psychology and branding. Okay, so it's good to have a look at that Schmidt article we talked about in the first 2 lectures, because that brings all that kind of psychology and branding literature together. But also you understand the potential ethical impacts of brand management. You know, we've talked through the module, we've looked at lots of different ways that you can manage a brand so it's successful. And now just want you to demonstrate to me that you have a conscience and you are aware of the problems that being a commercial brand manager might be, and ultimately what you need to be mindful of. Okay, so I hope you found that helpful. If you've got any questions, obviously just drop me an email, and good luck with the rest of your studies here, and I'll probably see some of you when you're doing your dissertations.